I now have the honor of introducing our first speaker, who will also moderate the first portion of today's presentation, Vinod Daniel. Vinod is the CEO of India Vision Institute and chairman of the board of AusHeritage, and he has worked on heritage projects in over 40 countries. Vinod, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you to the organizing team for this very important, timely, and relevant conference on disaster risk management for cultural heritage. Good to see a stellar list of speakers addressing the important issues of risk management and disaster management. Many of them I've learned much from and I look up to. The speakers, audience, and the various aspects within the museum world they represent make it truly global. So in my short time, I thought I'll probably do a little bit of background, maybe 3 aspects, and then also probably bring in 4 aspects for people to consider, as you go through this whole symposium. The first one is, over the past decade, much work has happened in disaster management in all aspects, including prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. This has been improved, perfected, and many modules are available, including the recently launched UNESCO Disaster Management Toolkit. This toolkit focuses on cultural and documentary heritage in archives, libraries, and museums and galleries, and it's currently being rolled out through Southeast Asia, South Asia. I mean, it's truly something that is very global. The second broad observation is, similarly, thanks to the insurance industry and pioneers like Bob Waller and Stefan McCaskey, collection risk management has become part of the process in several institutions. The structured approach identifying the 10 agents, including physical forces, fire, water, theft, vandalism, displacers, pests, contaminants, light and UV, incorrect temperature, incorrect relative humidity, custodial neglect. These and ways to assess each of the agents and mechanisms to minimize their impact have been very valuable globally for museums. And the third aspect is, it's getting more and more important, which is the impact of climate change, global warming, and unstable weather conditions, including changes in temperature, torrential rain, and floods. We have to provide safe custody to artifacts that have and are being collected and stored in museums and their reserves for future generations. Buildings also need to adapt to energy efficiency requirements. This, together with necessary adaptations to indoor conditions for exhibiting and storage of valuable artifacts for the proper preservation and preventive conservation, as well as digitization, which requires human and financial resources upskilling and training. With this background in mind, I'll just bring out 4 aspects for consideration, which I will table before you. The first one is, whether it's disaster or risk management, we need to collectively work to make it practically possible for many more collecting institutions globally to implement and benefit, not just the top 5% of the ones in developed countries. Having worked extensively in the developing part of the world, I can confirm that many museums do not have a plan or are not aware what it involves. Even in developed countries, it will be a small percentage that have one. We need to extend this coverage and simplify the approach. And again, I thank the organizers for this forum for doing it. The second aspect I want to table is, we need to recognize the importance of collections in private hands or religious trusts. I envisage this would be about 90% of cultural collections globally. Now, they probably are much more in danger than even collections in public institutions. I'll give you a simple example. I had an opportunity to work with a very famous sports personality in India. He's a very famous cricketer. He had kept all his cricket collections. I mean, he's like a god here in India. He had all his cricket collections all safely locked up in a room. That room had nothing to minimize in case there was a fire or any other disaster, but it was just kept there, locked up, and it'll be a great, great loss to humanity if those collections disappear. Now, the third aspect I just want to table is how can technology contribute to take these aspects more globally? Within the museum domain, technology seems to take a stronger role in the public face of institutions, especially displays. How can we leverage this more and more for back-end aspects, especially collection comfort and security, and also for capacity building, especially for the three aspects I highlighted earlier? And lastly, custodial neglect, which is an important aspect within the risk management framework, is an important aspect, not just for the people within a museum who handle collections, but also for the people who have influence, including political leaders and bureaucrats. Just a day before yesterday, I'm spending the last few weeks in Chennai. We kind of had a cyclone Fengal that passed through the southern part of India, affecting two states, Tamil Nadu and Pondicherry. Lots of good work happened with the government to minimize damage from flooding, especially from a human life and a household damage perspective. It would be good to add collection security also in a very small way within the priorities for preparedness, since I envisage hundreds of collecting institutions would have been affected by the cyclone as it passed through. So again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to make this opening comment. Now I'll just kind of introduce the first keynote speaker and pass on the floor to the first keynote speaker. So our first keynote speaker is Dr. Ihor Poshyvailo from Kyiv in Ukraine. Dr. Ihor is a general director of the National Museum of Revolution of Dignity, also called as the Maidan Museum. Ihor is the ex-chairman of the Museum Council at the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture. He holds a PhD in history and is a corresponding member of the Anthropological Institute of America. He was a Fulbright scholar at the Smithsonian Institution. In 2022, Ihor co-founded the Heritage Emergency Response Initiative, HERI, the Agency for Cultural Resilience, ACCURE, and the CER Regional Hub in the Black Sea. In 2023, Ihor received the Cultural Protection Award and the AIA Award for Outstanding Public Service. In 2024, he won the Kenneth Hudson Award for Institutional and Professional Integrity from the European Museum Forum. Now, Ihor is going to speak to us today on cultural emergency response at war, challenges and lessons from Ukraine. Over to you, Dr. Ihor.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for initiating a discussing of this topic, and thank you for having me today. I'll share some of my experience, quite new. For several decades, I worked for different museums in Ukraine, and what we are facing today, it was also unusual for us, quite peaceful country, but the situation, the war, the crisis happened, and I'd like to share some lessons from Ukraine. So let me share my screen. I hope you hear and see me. So let me start by saying that in February 2022, explosions woke me up in Kyiv, Ukraine. Russian airstrikes, missile shelling, and tank fires touched not only my family, my friends, our communities, and my nation. They targeted our cultural identity and our centuries-old heritage. And here on the slide you can see that Ukraine's cultural heritage is quite big. We have a lot of monuments. Our museum collections are quite big, over 12 million objects. So, and also speaking about cultural heritage, we talk not only about buildings or objects, cultural values. We speak also about people. so-called cultural capital. And here you can see also that the cultural sector in Ukraine before the war was quite big, extensive. And we also have a number of UNESCO World Heritage sites. In Ukraine, you may know St. Sophie Cathedral or Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra in Kyiv, but also recently historical centers of Lviv. This is a city in western Ukraine, or Odessa in south of Ukraine, were inscribed into UNESCO's World Heritage List recently when the large scale war started in 2022. It was a hope that this inscription would protect those cultural heritage sites and collections in times of war, but unfortunately, it did not happen. Here you can see mapping of cultural heritage in Ukraine provided by Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab in Virginia at the Natural History Museum. When the war started in 2014, they just mapped the most important cultural heritage sites, institutions, and collections in Ukraine, and it happened to be more than 30,000. And you can see how dense it is all over Ukraine. And speaking about the challenge we faced from the very first days of a large-scale aggression against Ukraine, it's a very intensive attack all over Ukraine. It's not only some regional, a local conflict, a local emergency. It's a large-scale emergency for Ukrainian cultural heritage in particular. And here you can see some quick figures, how many missiles and drones attacked Ukraine since 2022. So unfortunately, Ukraine was not ready to effectively protect its cultural heritage at that time. And why, you may ask? First of all, due to the lack of relevant knowledge, experience, resources, coordination, and most importantly, lack of awareness at the highest decision-making levels of the role of Ukraine's identity in this war. A lack of understanding that it is precisely in the crossroad of Putin's terroristic regime. So you can see here that how many thousand objects were hit, mostly civil infrastructure, but also a huge number of cultural heritage sites are within these statistics of being attacked. And of course, speaking to damage to culture, we speak, as I mentioned before, about movable, immovable, intangible cultural heritage, which is impacted because of the war by destruction, damage, looting, vandalism, of course, illicit trafficking. And speaking about cultural infrastructure, we speak about people, institutions, communities, which are impacted by war, by forced resettlement, loss of life, trauma, burnout, and of course, loss of resources. It's quite obvious for Ukraine that ignoring international military and humanitarian laws, as well as the Hague Convention of 1954 and its protocols on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, did not happen spontaneously due to so-called military necessity. It was the desire to reboot the cultural identity of Ukrainians as a core, and this policy was the core of the Kremlin's genocidal policy. And the result of this policy, you can see on the slide, it speaks for itself. During almost over last 3 years of the full-scale war, about 2,000 objects of cultural infrastructure were damaged. And this statistics, of course, is very conventional because Ukraine has no access to gray zones, to territories under active military actions, and of course no access to monitor the situation on the occupied, hopefully temporary occupied territories. Here you can see also, you can see how many cultural centers, religious sites, museums, libraries, theaters, and other cultural infrastructure objects are being impacted. And what is most dramatic that a quite big number, up to 10% of cultural institutions, are on temporary occupied territories. This is also a very, very sad situation for us here. According to Andriy Kostyin, it's our Prosecutor General of Ukraine, the damage caused to war to Ukraine's cultural heritage amounted to $19 billion. It was estimated a few months ago. And he emphasized the genocidal intent behind these actions. His quotation is quite illustrative. He said in one of the interviews to Western mass media that the scale and purposefulness of these crimes is yet another evidence of Kremlin's intentions to commit genocide against the Ukrainian people. So speaking about emergency response, you can see what kind of actions we had to undertake. And of course, immediately after February 24 in 2022, the Ukrainian cultural sector quickly self-organized. The new created public and volunteer initiatives strive to protect their collection and premises and help others. Coordinating efforts at different levels were very, very important and impressive for us here. It was important to provide support to institutions, local and central governments. At the same time, cultural activists in cooperation with local authorities and communities turned public spaces into so-called cultural barricades, sheltering monuments and sculptures, facade decorations and other artistic and historical objects with OSB panels and sandbags for protection. And here you can see on the slide the photographs of evacuating collections from the Sheptytsky National Art Museum in Lviv. And here you can see the most important actions we had to take when the crisis happened. And we had to take care about evacuation of collections, but this is not enough. We had to find safe temporary storages, but after this, we had to guarantee the necessary conditions for keeping the relocated collections. Documentation of damage and risk for both tangible, intangible heritage, important stabilization of the damaged buildings, collections, forensic investigation, documenting war crimes, and we have a lot of groups, mostly non-governmental, in Ukraine, which coordinates with OPG, Office of Prosecutor General, National Police, and other international law enforcement agencies. Illicit trafficking is one of the big issues because quite a big level of illicit trafficking happened since 2022. But of course, it was important for us from the very first days, work not only on tactical operational level, we had to think about strategic, our plan, what we do tomorrow, what we do the day after tomorrow. And therefore, it was important for us to develop individual and institutional capacities. Therefore, we provided a lot of trainings to build, to make our cultural heritage, objects and people much more resilient and resistant in this situation. And finally, all these actions on tactical level, according to our vision, had to be implemented or continue or finalize in creating so-called national system of emergency response management, which includes a lot of elements mentioned today in the introduction. So first aid response, existing and activating of the first aiders teams, knowledge, experience, and resources for preparedness, for mitigation, for preparation for early recovery. So a lot of important actions which were not available for us in that period. In particular, my personal case is that, for example, in 2022, we did what we can do in that situation. We self-organized, a few NGOs, and the National Maidan Museum. And so we developed Heritage Emergency Response Initiative, which today works on base of two legal entities, Agency for Cultural Resilience, ACURE, and HEMO, Heritage Monitoring Lab. So here you can see some very, very simple issues. For example, the Maidan Museum, where I serve as a director, we managed to prepare for emergency response. For example, our staff created groups for prioritization and packaging of our collection in advance. So which, after approval of authorities, we were able to transport to safer locations in Western Ukraine. We did everything ourselves, having limited resources, but being highly motivated to protect our heritage, as well as a lot of our colleagues in hundreds of other cultural institutions. And in this situation, the solidarity of the whole world coming together to protect culture in times of war in Ukraine is unprecedented in scale, and we are so grateful to them. And for example, on these slides, you can see one of the support actions provided by the Smithsonian Institution to the National Restoration and Research Center in Ukraine, which is under Ministry of Culture. They provided, in particular, besides all the conservation materials, a lot of individual support of the center staff. They provided them very simple thing, mobility, engaging even Uber service, taxi service, because the team of the National Conservation Center needed monitoring the damaged or relocated collections all over Ukraine, and providing them mobility. And later they donated, Smithsonian Institution provided funds for buying a minivan for this team for permanent expeditions. So it enabled systematic monitoring and stabilization of the damaged or endangered movable heritage of Ukraine. Also, due to a number of international partners, we managed to provide a lot of field trips all over Ukraine, documenting and assessing damage and risk on different levels. Also, we used, first of all, we engaged the existed methodology, international methodology, in particular ICOM's damage and risk assessment forms for all kinds of heritage, movable, immovable, intangible, and even separately ecological sites. And here you can see one of the first international mission to Ukraine in partnership with ICOMOS and ICOM. Here you may recognize Teresa Patricia, president of ICOMOS, and Aparna Tandon from ICOM. And here's Emmanuel Durand, engineer and architect who worked a lot in Beirut, documenting the damaged buildings because of the blast. And he came as a volunteer in the first months of the large-scale invasion and helped us a lot to document the sites and even to prepare them for stabilization and early recovery. We also document movable heritage all over Ukraine because the historical buildings in many cases contain very, very important, valuable collections. Immobile heritage documentation, also you can see examples from all over Ukraine, from, for example, Sumy region in north, Odessa in south, Kherson in eastern Ukraine, and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. We not only accepted the existed methodology, I mentioned before ICOM's methodology, ICOM's forms, damage and risk assessment. We tested them in the field and adjusted them to our specific context. And this is also very important. So you can see the example of this form. And we also were commissioned by UNESCO and other international organizations to provide damage and risk assessment, which is also very important. Because in Ukraine, for example, the situation was so frustrating, such a big damage, very, very shocking news, not enough resources, not enough experience and methodologies. So a lot of people were ready to act. And a lot of volunteers came to help, for example, museums or other cultural institutions damaged, but at the same time helping to clean up the damaged territory after missile attack, for example, or artillery shelling. Sometimes they destroy the very important layers of information, or some elements from historical buildings are missing. So we need some trainings, we need some special approach. And thanks to international organizations, we had a lot of discussions, round tables. We developed a lot of guidelines. We invited a lot of international experts. And these joint missions, when in particular we were commissioned by UNESCO to provide damage and risk assessment in Odessa. Maybe you know that Odessa is nicknamed as Southern Palmyra. A lot of monuments in a quite good condition before the war, and a part of the UNESCO heritage list. And last summer and autumn, very, very badly damaged buildings, collections, civilian infrastructure there. So this is some examples of our own type of reports, because we developed them to be instrumental, not informational, but important to later analysis for construction engineers, for architects, whom we sometimes lack during our field expeditions. Because I mentioned before, we are losing people in different ways. Some of them are drafted to army, some of them left Ukraine, some have so many functions today, are quite busy. So it's not easy to engage professionals to address the most important, the most prioritized challenges in protecting cultural heritage. Also, some of the example of our report. And here's one more example that the final result of such like documentation should be actions. And the former museum in Chernihiv, this is northern city, which is nicknamed as a city of museums. The former museum and right now library for use was badly damaged by air bombing at the very beginning of the large-scale aggression. And here you can see that due to a lot of efforts, Ali Foundation, World Monument Fund, and a lot of other international founders, this building was stabilized and prepared for early recovery. Also speaking today, we speak about how to protect collections. And in this connection, it's crucial to map our stakeholders, because in our situation, our knowledge, our resources, I mean our museum people, if we work for museum, or cultural heritage people, not enough. We should coordinate our actions with emergency services, with police, with law enforcement. In time of bigger, large-scale crisis like war, it's important to have as a partner armed forces. And many armies within NATO has so-called CPP units as a separate CIMIC cooperation. So the reserved officers participate in rescuing collections, buildings, in planning, in preparedness, in training soldiers who participate later in missions or in military actions. In Ukraine, it's very, very important. Unfortunately, we did not develop CPP units within armed forces, but we developed it within territorial defense. So this is a voluntarily military unit. And my team participates in this CPP unit. And it's very important because you can see on this picture to the right, that's the soldiers, for example, digging the trenches. They find some important archaeological objects, and they, in many cases, don't know what to do. Sometimes they may consider that it's a kind of souvenir or trophy for them. So they do not know much about the Hague Convention issues, and it's important to work with military on different level, on raising acknowledges, on training them, on engaging them to rescue operations, especially on territories which are not open because of the security issues to civil cultural heritage people. Also, digitization is one of the most important strategies to protect cultural heritage in a very extensive crisis, because you cannot protect, you cannot shelter the building, the collection in boxes by OSB panels when you have the direct missile or air bombing attacks. Digitization. This is a very, very important thing. But digitization, not only objects, but also inventories, very, very important. So we launched a mobile digital lab due to support of ALIF and Cultural Emergency Response Initiative. So right now we travel all over Ukraine and help other museums in whose collections are most endangered to digitize documentation and their collections. We also work actively in developing capacity, training different staffs, because it's not enough to have a national or regional, local teams of first aiders. Each team of each cultural institution should be trained on different levels, of course, depending upon the risk assessment. But they should be, the emergency preparedness plans should be developed, but they should exist not only on paper. That should be discussed within the team, and the team should be trained to be able to implement this planning. In the very beginning, in 2015, after the war started, we developed some international methodologies. And here you can see the United States Emergency Response and Salvage Wheel, which is translated into Ukrainian. There are the Netherlands UNESCO playing cards for military, for CPP. This is also the pocket emergency plan. Very, very simple, but very effective in Ukraine's context guidances. We also translated UNESCO's and ICOM's guidance on evacuating of cultural values in times of emergency. We translated also ICOM's toolkit and handbook, which exists in both digital and paper printed form. Very, very important, very instrumental for us today. And recently we developed the National Cultural First Aiders Team, which can be deployed by our government in any time needed, which can train and develop a network of other teams on local level. And also recently, in September, we established the Black Sea Regional Hub, which is under Cultural Emergency Response in Amsterdam. So we have a lot of challenges, and you can see some of them here. Of course, we have a lot of them, and at the same time, we have to admit that the fact that the war keeps going on, it's very important. And there is uncertainty about the situation and possible actions for employees of cultural institutions in the occupied territories. The social vulnerability of cultural workers and forced immigration is increasing. There is also, as I mentioned before, fatigue, exhaustion, and burnout. But the Ukrainian cultural and heritage fields are full of energy and actions. The museums reopened their exhibitions and educational programs. They enlarged their collections with new objects and stories connected to the war, like my museum, for example. They exchanged exhibitions and programs with their colleagues abroad and participate in numerous granting and exchange programs. And for example, for us, it was such a big honor and very important to launch our traveling exhibitions in the United States, in Canada, in some countries of Europe. For example, we had the exhibition, we launched the exhibition, The Damaged Temples of Ukraine. But finally, we learned a lot of lessons. And you can see some of them here mentioned, some of them, not all. As I mentioned, importance of emergency response system needed. The crisis management leadership should be established, if not existed, and well trained, and be ready to activate it immediately when crisis happens, and to be engaged in the preparedness phase. Evacuation process, very important. Everything should be clearly developed. You should know what should be engaged for evacuation processes, where to evacuate or relocate, who should be engaged, who is responsible, who can be helpful, like stakeholders, to provide materials, equipment, even some resources for transportation and for creating the conditions in the relocated safer storage. Emergency planning, important digitization processes, coordination. I'm a member of the European Union Commission subgroup, which developed recently recommendations for European governments, for European Commission, and for Ukrainian national and local governments. And I think it's very, very comprehensive document. You can find it on the page of European Commission. We analyzed everything, and I think connected to today's situation. And I think you can also find a lot of very important issues connected to your context, to your situation. Because for us, it's important not only to speak about ourselves, about our problems and challenges and how we solve them, but we would like that the rest of the world learn our lessons, Ukrainian lessons, to become more resistant and resilient in any kind of crisis may happen. So in this, I'd like to, I'm running out of time. I thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you for your attention and for standing with Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ihor Poshyvailo, for that comprehensive summary, highlighting the challenges and also the lessons learned. I think for the participants, we'll have an opportunity at 15:10 UTC during the Q&A session to clarify, ask any questions to Dr. Ihor. Thank you so much. Now let me invite the next keynote speaker. The next keynote speaker is a good friend, Sophie Delepierre. She's the head of Heritage Protection Department at the International Council of Museums, ICOM, which she joined in 2017. In close cooperation with ICOM's worldwide network, she leads international operational programs and awareness raising activities related to heritage protection and emergency actions from museums' perspective. She regularly represents ICOM at international conferences on the strategies to fight the illicit trafficking of cultural property. Previously at ICOM, she was a legal advisor and institutional affairs coordinator. Before joining ICOM, she worked several years at UNESCO on the implementation of the 1970 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. Her talk today is on the role of ICOM in the protection of cultural heritage in crisis, how to address the challenges. Over to you, Sophie.
Dear Vinod, thank you very much for the introduction and kind words, and it's also a pleasure to see you again. I hope you hear me well. So, thank you for your kind invitation to speak at this conference on disaster risk management for cultural heritage. In case you are not familiar with the International Council of Museums, our organization was founded in 1947 by and for museum professionals and now counts almost 60,000 members all over the world. Museums have no borders, they have a network. This is ICOM's motto. The general structure of our organization is based on our 120 national committees. Among them is ICOM-Brazil, who will also intervene during this conference, and 34 international committees who are each committed to different areas of expertise in the museum field. Among them are two more also associated to this conference, ICOM-CC, the ICOM Committee for Conservation, and DRMC, the ICOM Disaster Resilient Museums Committee. At the International Secretariat, much of our work and our focus is on preparedness and the coordinated response of emergency, whether they are consequence of conflict or of climate change. For that reason, it will be my pleasure today to present about our department's main activities and tools which can help to protect museum collection and their staff in the direct response to disasters and emergencies. In addition, I want to offer some examples of what these tools look like when they are used in practice, as well as some updates on our work in Brazil, specifically in response to the recent floods, which had a disastrous effect on several parts of the country. I know that later in this conference, there will be some in-depth discussion on the responses in Brazil, but I want to talk about it specifically in terms of ICOM's network and why nourishing that network is an important part of building our resilience and our preparedness as museum professionals. Heritage protection is one of the founding principles of ICOM and remains one of our main priorities today, as indicated in our current strategic plan 2022-2028. Our work is underpinned by international law, such as the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflicts and its sub-protocols, the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, and the 1995 Ihor Convention on stolen or illegally exported cultural objects. And of course, it is written into the ICOM Code of Ethics for Museum, which is recognized by the museum community as the main international standard of museum practice and heritage management. To protect heritage, the code gives clear guidance on ethical acquisition, provenance, documentation, in particularly guidance on the due diligence to establish the full history of items as well as on returns and restitutions. Maybe you are aware that the code is now under revision to respond to contemporary museum practice. The preparedness in case of disaster is also clearly written into the code. For example, it states that museums should develop and maintain policies to protect the public and the personnel, the collection and other resources against natural and human-made disasters, and that museum governing bodies should ensure appropriate security to protect collections against theft or damage in displays, exhibition, working or storage areas, and while in transit. As such, a large part of ICOM's efforts to act in times of a disaster is on focusing on preparation so that the work to respond to disaster is already in place. Our tools and activities therefore focus on promoting emergency preparedness and on implementing good inventory practices. Among these tools, perhaps many of you are already familiar with them, but they are Object ID, the ICOM Red List, and the Observatory on Illicit Trafficking. Object ID is an internationally recognized documentation standard conceived to identify and record cultural goods. It sets a standardized procedure to describe and document cultural objects. How the same object is described by someone can vary greatly depending on many factors, and even more in case of emergency. As such, these discrepancies can lead to issues in case an object is stolen or lost. By standardizing the identification of this object, their recovery in case of loss or theft is greatly aided. The Object ID format is simple. It provides the category to organize an art collection and then provides the fields to describe each object in a very simple yet efficient way. These refer to its size, materials, authorship, if available, etc., as well as instruction on how to photograph the object, an important aspect of this documentation. It is freely available online in 17 languages in order to make it as accessible as possible for users across the world. As an indication of its relevancy, we could stress that Interpol has used Object ID when creating the ID Art mobile app related to the stolen works of a database. The app also offers to register some object, and to this aim, Interpol asks to use this existing standard developed. ICOM is absolutely convinced of the value of this tool. It is for this reason that we have undertaken several recent projects, also on documentation, which train museum professionals in how to use object ID. Among them is our 2 recent projects undertaken with ALIF, about which I will speak a little bit more later. The ICOM Red List identifies categories of cultural objects at risk of theft and trafficking. They help individuals, organizations, and authorities, including the police and customs, to identify objects at risk and prevent them from being sold or exported illegally. While a red list is not a list of stolen objects, it serves to illustrate the categories of our cultural property most exposed to illicit trafficking in case of theft or loss. For now, we have published 20 red lists, covering the areas of the world which are most vulnerable in terms of the illicit trafficking of cultural objects. Red lists are now being prepared for Turkey and Greece, and an update of the Afghanistan red list is also in preparation. While the red list addressed issue of trafficking, which may be well established or documented, ICOM also tries to be as agile as possible in responding to emergencies as they develop. This, for example, is demonstrated by the emergency red list for cultural objects at risk Ukraine, which was prepared in direct response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian Federation in 2022. In this instance, the red list was prepared quickly thanks to ICOM Ukraine to respond to the threats posed by the conflict to Ukraine's museum's collections. For this reason, we also consider the red list to be important tools for emergency response, especially in conflict situations, but of course also in the context of natural disaster, especially when a museum's surrounding infrastructure and the structure of the building, for example, is compromised and therefore security is affected. Please make sure to keep an eye for the launch of the next red list. The Observatory on Illicit Trafficking was established just over 10 years ago, thanks to EU support as an online tool, freely accessible, to serve as an information data bank, gathering thousands of resources on illicit traffic and the means to fight it. The objectives are to improve monitoring methods, data gathering, and scientific research, to foster the exchange of good practices and to raise awareness about this traffic. Though I cannot share many details with you today, I'm pleased to tell you that the observatory will undergo a renewal over the coming years, so I invite you to stay tuned for news on the next phase of this project in the months to come. It is also important to stress that ICOM recognizes the importance of digital technologies in the mission of museums and the roles that they play in the promotion and protection of cultural heritage within both their local and global community. To reach our goal, we also collaborate with international partners to develop, support, and promote innovative digital approach to aid in the protection of cultural heritage. Through its partnerships and involvement in international projects, such as, for example, the European Commission-funded project on cheese, ICOM is working to reinforce capabilities and encourage the more diffuse use of current digital technologies for the protection and preservation of cultural heritage. In doing so, ICOM is helping to steward digital capabilities both within and beyond the cultural heritage sector through the development of an operational set of digital tools that will help strengthen the protection of cultural heritage using new and evolving technologies. Central to the spirit of this object is ensuring the interoperability of tools, which will be designed with wide reach and relevance that crosses borders. It also encourages the multi-sectoral cooperation. In conclusion of this point, on ICOM's tools, I would like to stress that those tools are simple but intended to have a maximum impact. They complement each other and they interact with other initiatives developed by our partners. To now move on how these tools work in practice, I would like to talk about two case studies, one regarding emergency preparedness in at-risk areas, and the other regarding climate and natural disaster in Brazil. The ALIF ICOM Emergency Grant Project for combating illicit trafficking of cultural goods in Côte d'Ivoire was successfully completed last year with the ICOM Côte d'Ivoire National Committee and thanks to the financial support of the International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, ALIF. Though the project took place in the terms of an emergency project, really this project was about putting emergency preparedness measures in place so that museums would be well equipped and ready to respond to emergency as they occur. Renovation works were completed in the two selected museums in the Indénié-Duablin region of Eastern Côte d'Ivoire, the Jean-Marie Adiafié Museum in Béthier, a community ethnographic and archaeological museum, and the Louis-Gustave Binger Museum in Zaranou, the custodian of tangible, intangible, movable, and immovable heritage located near the border with Ghana. The completion of the security measures in repairing roofs, doors, and windows, adding waterproofing measures to combat regular flooding, and constructing a collection store. This enabled both museums to achieve the objective of providing the collections with the basic means of protection against theft and environmental damage. When completing the assessment mission in both villages, we were welcomed by local communities and authorities. They explained to us the place that the museum represents in their village and in their lives. Therefore, we observed once again the place of a museum within its social environment. During this project, we also undertook specific training for the museum professional in risk management and documentation. A second project, also supported by ALIF and implemented in collaboration with ICOM national committees in Burkina Faso and Mali, was concluded earlier this year. The project equipped museum professionals from 22 museums in Burkina Faso and Mali with skills in the documentation of collections, storage management, and emergency planning. Basic security measures such as padlocks, fire extinguishers, and CCTV systems, as well as materials like computers and storage shelves for documentation and reserve management, were also provided. As such, this object really aimed to equip museum professionals with the skills to make them prepared for emergency, for disasters, and as a result, to be able to meet the standards that are set by the ICOM Code of Ethics. A lot of focus was put on the interdisciplinary transfer of knowledge and in strengthening the exchange between local and regional museum professionals. This exchange was requested by the two national committees when constructing the project and was indeed extremely appreciated by the professionals of both countries, as we were told. While we place a lot of value in the development of skills and these practical tools, we also consider the network that ICOM provides to be of huge benefit. At the Secretariat and through our work in heritage protection, we have strong links with Interpol, UNESCO, UNIDROIT, the World Customs Organization. In addition, we have good dialogue with national partners such as ministries, law enforcement agencies, especially police and customs, NGOs and academia. We are also in close contact with several NGOs and foundations working at international level who are active in disaster and emergency response. There's ALIF, whom I just spoke about, and Culture Emergency Response, and ICOM, with whom we have just renewed our Memorandum of Understanding. It is also important to recall that ICOM is also proudly one of the founding members, the 4 founding members of the Blue Shield, and for this reason had a seat on its board. For several years, ICOM is also chairing the Blue Shield Accreditation Committee, which helped with the creation of new Blue Shield national committees, as well as re-accreditation process. Such involvement of our organization aims to ensure an efficient cooperation at national level in case of emergencies. My goal when presenting such connection between organization and within ICOM is to show that this network allows us to play a role in creating links to facilitate contacts that can aid the progress of an emergency response. The floodings that hit the Rio Grande do Sul region in Brazil in April and May 2024 are an example of how this network is activated when needed. ICOM-Brazil and the ICOM Secretariat have been working hand in hand since the first moment of the flood. The Secretariat acted as a link between ICOM-Brazil and the international organizations ready to help, such as Cultural Emergency Response or the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. Following this initial impulse, ICOM-Brazil then supported UNESCO and the governments to organize a damage assessment mission in the region. The ICOM network of museum professionals are also prove its great value in this moment, as ICOM-Brazil was able to recommend local experts to guide the mission. The strength of the network, of course, is also evident in the many activities that are being implemented by ICOM national committees and international committees. In recent months, we, as well as many committees with whom we are in contact, have noted an alarming rise in the frequency and severity of flooding across the world. In many cases, the Secretariat has been in touch with the respective national committees to understand the scale of the effect flooding is having on museums. This contact also brought to our attention some of the tools that are available and which are being developed by ICOM's network. For instance, in the past few months in Europe, there have been catastrophic floods. Czechia, unfortunately, has experienced important flooding in the past, and this experience informs much of the expertise which they are now sharing more widely with museum professionals in a bid to help them as they also tackle this problem. We also highlight the initiative taken by ICOM Austria, who in 2021, together with Blue Shield Austria, developed a new tag for museum collections, which identifies objects which should be evacuated first in the event of a natural or human-caused disaster. It is to be stressed that it is freely available as a resource to any museum professional who wants to use it and to implement it in the emergency preparedness plan. Another interesting resource, and one which is again widely available freely to anybody who would like to access it, is the ICOM-CC guide on water damage. We recently were in touch with colleagues in ICOM Spain who are dealing with the aftermath of the terrible disaster that took place in Valencia just a few weeks ago. They mentioned these resources to us, that they have worked on a Spanish translation of the document to make it quickly available to Spanish-speaking museum professionals everywhere. This is just one more example of the strength of the network, and I think the generosity which propels it, which is its great strength. And invite you to visit our website where we share information about the global floods as well as the resources that we were able to gather. As a last example, I would like to mention the initiative of ICOM Europe, who decided to organize its 2024 conference on heritage resilience, safeguarding cultural legacy in crisis zone. In close cooperation with ICOM Georgia, this conference was organized in Tbilisi together with a training and finished yesterday. This training and conference focused on three main directions. First, on ad hoc solutions and case study in safeguarding cultural heritage during crisis, with sharing lessons learned from other countries such as Armenia or Ukraine. We heard Ihor a few minutes who specifically spoke about the lesson learned from the previous situations. Secondly, on the role of international, regional, and national entities in heritage protection, we need to know who is there and who can help. And finally, on the role of communicating in crisis management. We all know the importance of communication in those situations. The mix between training and conference offer to the participant, trainers, and speakers the opportunity to go back with relevant takeaways while having the time to discuss some available tools and experience with ICOM network. I am back from Tbilisi since yesterday, and given this political situation in the country, I also believe that organizing this training and conference in Georgia was necessary, of course, but also symbolic. I would like to conclude here, but would once more like to thank very much the organizers for offering ICOM Secretariat to give this opportunity, this opening keynote today. I wish you a wonderful conference ahead, exciting and illuminating discussions, and as ever, please feel free to reach out to ICOM Secretariat in case you have any questions or ideas you would like to share with us. We are always delighted to hear about initiatives focusing on heritage protection and combine our strength and energy to this goal. In case you would like to keep up to date with the project that I mentioned, which are coming up, do not hesitate to follow us on social media and website, as we are regularly sharing information updates there. Thank you for your attention and all the best for this online conference.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you so much for the great work you've been doing. I'm quite aware, having worked with you in ICOM as part of the board for 6 years, and also the work that ICOM has been doing. I think we'll probably have a bit of time during the Q&A session where people can ask more questions, but I do understand you won't be able to stay back, but there'll be others who might be able to answer.